In South Africa, we've had British rule from the Union of South Africa. After the Brits, and having said recently with the advocate Ike Khumalo, one of the things he raised was the Brits had just come off 2 world wars. They didn't have many resources, and they decided to take a step back from some of their colonies. And in doing that, they decided they needed representatives and ambassadors. Look, we still had lords that were running aspects of South Africa. We had a Union of South Africa, and they ran this country as a union. And later on, the Afrikaners would get into parliament, get into politics, get into the National Party, and run this country. Black people were shafted off their land, and they started fighting. And come 1990, there was the unbanning of liberation movements. And in 1994, the ANC government of Nelson Mandela came into power. 30 years later, we're here now. That is our more recent history. British rule under a union, apartheid rule under the National Party, and then post-democratic Africa under the ANC. This is very interesting to note because most people are not aware. Apartheid under Verwoerd was enacted in 1948. 1948, and it would last until 1990. The Land Act, the Native Lands Act, the Bantu Land Act, is from 1913. Not when apartheid started in 1948, but years before that in 1913. So when people believe that it's only Afrikaners, it was all the white leadership of the time that were in agreement that the black majority of this country needed to be forcefully removed off of the majority land of this country. 1913. It would only be 35 years later that apartheid would be enacted. The agreements of the 1913 Native Lands Act or the Bantu Lands Act, what they agreed on was that black people should only occupy 10% of all land in South Africa. Mind you, black people have always been 80% of the population in this country. But that 80%, they decided should occupy only 10%. And when they enacted this, they got it right with 7% of the land. 80% of the population on 7%. There would be 23 years of fighting thereafter where black people would eventually be on 13% of the land. From 7 to 13%. That is where black people were forced to live. Over time, there'd be black people that would then start moving into what we'd call townships, some informal settlements because the white areas needed domestic workers. They needed gardeners. The mines in particular needed laborers, people that would go down and dig. Some of the farms, some of the factories. So there'd be what we'd call white areas with black people traveling with taxis, minibus taxis, to these areas. According to the 1913 Native Land Act, white people could not sell land to black people. What's even worse is that even black people that were leasing land from white people could not lease that land. If there was a land owned by white people on a farm and black people were subleasing that land, they could not. It was not allowed. What was protected was the communal land by the kings and the chiefs, which we still see to this day. The dispossession of the land of black people included things like livestock. There was a killing of livestock or the straight up theft of livestock, but theft legally. The crops that were on there, and even any infrastructure and homes that had been built by black people on these lands. Black people were forced to become laborers in white areas, but with minimal wages, exploitative wages. And sadly, along with these, black people could not get a decent education like white children. We speak about Bantu education today. That was point number 5. Point number 6 starts with now the formation of what became the ANC. Educated black man, writer, spoke good English, John Langalbalele Dube, used his newspaper to start speaking about the atrocities of this Native Lands Act. And he'd be joined by other people, Pixley Kaisaka Sem and other other gentlemen that formed the African National Congress back then, all the way in 1912. They began the fight for black people from apartheid, which would come in 1948 along the way, oppression. People like Saul Plaatje were involved as well. And some of these people travel all the way to England to go and fight, to go and ask for the British monarch to intervene with what's happening in South Africa. These fights would end in 1990 with the loss of many lives, imprisonment, and other atrocities. I think we've spoken a lot about the fight for liberation in this country. The ANC, the PAC, we'd have Mangosuthu Buthelezi, Inkatha Freedom Party, the IFP come in. There'd be AZAPO, there'd be the guerrilla wing of the ANC that was forced because the negotiations and the conversations were not going anywhere. The MK. You'd have APLA, another military wing. You'd have stories like June 76, where the youth were gunned down, fighting against Afrikaans being a language of instruction. We'd have the women marching to the union buildings. I think they were led by people like Charlotte Maxege. Not sure if all Victoria Mxenge were involved. We had Abo Solomon Mahlangu, a young boy that was killed as an activist fighting for the freedom of this country. Even in the early days of the unbanning of the parties, we had Chris Hani. I think a general of Umkhonto weSizwe gunned down in his home. Very tragic at the time. Names came out, Struggle Warts, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Reginald Tambo, Nelson Mandela, of course, Mangaliso Sobuwe, father of black consciousness, Stephen Bantu Biko. We had people like Joe Slovo, Helen Joseph involved, and so many other people fighting so that black people could have a say in how this country is run from a political governance perspective, fighting also for the land to be given back to the people who occupied it. The Native Lands Act, the Bantu Land Act of 1913, was not a war per se in the conventional sense where weapons were picked up and people fought and black people were conquered in that war like some of the empires. It was a legal act where the tools of the state, the machinery of the state, the soldiers, the police were used. Places like Soweto, Alexandra, Tembisa, some of the informal settlements. Today we have songs about Meadowlands, Sophia Town, where people were shafted off of their land. One of the saddest parts of what's happened since the ANC has come into power is all the land that was forcefully taken has not been ring-fenced so that everyone is aware, and then it becomes a process of how do we deal with this? Instead, what the ANC government and others in government at the time have done is they've almost asked people to pitch. Where was your land taken? Come prove and, when that should have never been the case.